You know, in 1966, a guy called Robert Kennedy. Does anyone know Robert Kennedy? Great, brother of JFK. 1966, Robert Kennedy took a plane flight from the US down to South Africa, in the middle of apartheid South Africa, while Nelson Mandela was still in jail. He flew there on a trip that would have him banned from that country for the rest of his life, as it turned out. He got into South Africa and he was speaking on his last day, a day called the Day of Affirmation, to a university group, not unlike the group of people gathered here tonight, largely white people from suburban South Africa, in the middle of an apartheid. And he got up and he said some words that were inflammatory, but some words that I think ring really true for us today. He said, only earthbound man still clings to the idea, to the notion, the poisonous notion, that his world is bounded by the nearest hill, that his country ends at river shore, that his neighbor is only those who share his values, his beliefs, and the color of his skin. He said that in the middle of apartheid South Africa, but it rings true for us tonight. Because he finished that with a line that I think is so important for us as we consider how we can welcome the stranger. He said it's the illusion of difference that leads to all injustice and hate and war. The illusion of difference. And how much does that ring true for us when we consider the debate about asylum seekers in our country? I want us to take a step back and think a little bit about a parable that we probably all know quite well. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. Has anyone read or heard of that before? Give us a show of hands. Come on, I've got my hand up here. Don't leave me hanging. Right? The parable of the Good Samaritan. And we know it, right? The man's walking along the road, the Jewish man, and he gets attacked by robbers and left on the side of the road with nothing, left in ruins, right? And the priest walks past and he crosses to the other side of the road and he leaves him alone. And the next man walks along and takes a second look but leaves him be. And then the Samaritan comes and the Samaritan walks over to the man. But he kind of thinks the man looks a bit funny, right? He looks Jewish, he looks different to me. So he goes and rummages through his stuff, and the man kind of comes to and says, well, what are you doing? And the Samaritan looks down and says, well, you know, who are you? Who are you? And the Jewish man looks up and says, oh, I'm a Jewish man. I just got attacked by robbers. I have nothing. So the Samaritan responds with, well, where are your identity papers? And then the Jewish man says, I don't have any. I got robbed. But the Samaritan thinks, well, that's good, but I have to assume the worst because you don't have identity papers. And so he calls the police and locks him up. That's not the parable at all, right? The parable, I hope you guys know that. The parable itself is not that. The Samaritan walks over to the man and thinking not for a second that there is an illusion of difference between him, though their cultures are so different. He takes the man to an inn, he sets him up, he gives money for his care without knowing a thing about him. And Jesus ends that parable by saying, who in that scenario was a neighbor? The Samaritan. But why was he a neighbor? Not because he lived next door, not because he shared the faith or the colors of the skin of the man he was trying to help, but because he acted as a neighbor. And that's what I think we need to do as a church, as a people in Australia, that we need to stop thinking, well, who is our neighbor, and just start acting like neighbors. And that is how we can move forward on this issue in a compassionate way, but in a way that overflows with the love of God. Guys, that's what I want us to grapple with tonight. I'm not saying that that's the only solution. I'm not pretending to have the answers to this hugely complex political debate. But what I'm saying is that when we as a church see injustice, we need to come at it not with fear, but with the love of God. And to tell us a little bit more about that, I want to welcome up our first speaker. His name's Greg. Greg is an amazing guy. I met him earlier today only. So I don't know he's amazing, but he has a little puppy and it's a Kelpie, and he promised that I could keep it after. So yeah, really? That's pretty great.
Not on your life.
Greg's going to share with us a little bit of a story about his life. He's been grappling with that question of how does what I do for a living correspond with what God's will for my life is, but in pretty extraordinary circumstances working for the Department of Immigration. Greg, I'll leave it up to you.
Thank you very much for having me. I love that parable of the Samaritan because usually when we think of it, if you're familiar with it, you immediately think that the neighbor is the guy that you most identify with, the guy who was beaten up. But at the end of it, Jesus spins it on its head and says it's actually the Samaritan who was the neighbor, the one who is different. Tim's right. I guess my story is to say I grappled with the issue of how does my job, my profession, my life as a professional public servant, something which is supposed to be bureaucratic, boring, I fly a desk, I'm good at paperwork, the most risky thing I'll come across are literally paper cuts, with the idea that as a Christian, I'm required, actually compelled, to love my neighbour. And so I came across this challenge or this debate, this whole concept of asylum seekers accidentally. And to be honest, I would have identified more with the people sitting in that church that JFK's brother was speaking to. I grew up on the North Shore of Sydney, born in Pymble, typical North Shore. So all of you people from the south side, I've never seen you before and I don't know you. Sorry. When it says love your neighbour, now is your first opportunity to put that into practice, because I'm from the North Shore. I moved down the coast after that for a little while, but I was born into a middle-class, white Australian family who really, while my folks were political, perhaps in their university days, just had no reason to confront these questions. I'd never thought about the whole concept. I fell into the Department of Immigration accidentally. I kid you not, the job at immigration was just the first job I got offered. I was working in a bank, corporate banking, did just the right thing as a North Shore boy and hated it. So I thought, I'll go and get a job in the public service and change the world, right? And the only job I got offered was in skilled migration at the Department of Immigration. So I did 457 visas and all legislation changes and policy. Then I went on a bit of a secondment to research for a little while. When I came back, I needed a job back in the department, and I said, look, I'm looking for something a bit interesting, a bit challenging, a bit different, sick of immigration, skilled migration policy, where can I go? And they said, have we got a place for you? Why don't you go to Christmas Island? So they sent me to Christmas Island, and it was up there that I was first really struck by this issue. But actually it took longer than the first few days. And a lot of people go up to Nauru and places like that, and they come back after a 4-week contract with the Salvation Army or something, and they come back with a real overwhelming conviction about what they've seen. And perhaps I should be ashamed that I never got that. I was never shocked by Christmas Island. I was never shocked by Nauru. Not because I was so aware of the conditions and so it didn't shock me because I knew they were bad, so I was expecting it, but because it just didn't shock me. It didn't affect me at first. And so it actually took a while for me to come to the realization that even though my comfortable white middle class, upper class upbringing meant I should be able to just intellectualize everything, I had to actually confront this for myself. And I think there are a lot of Australians who are in exactly the position I was in. They don't need to be shocked by what they see on television because they see shocking stuff on TV. Just go and watch Sunrise. Well, maybe not Sunrise. That's a pretty low key. Maybe go and watch, First at 5, Channel 9 News or whatever channel it is. I don't watch the TV anymore. But I guess my point is I was confronted by it over time as I came to a realization that this is a bigger issue than perhaps we give it credit for. Went up to Christmas Island. I was on the island, and one of my teams, I was the operations director on the island. One of my teams was the team that looked after all the boat arrivals. So all the people who would show up at Flying Fish Cove and say, here we are, we're ready to be processed. And there was this one boy that I'll never forget. I won't tell you his name. He was an Iranian boy, and he came with his mother and a younger sister. He was probably about 12, maybe 11, 12, I guess. And his mother was a wonderful, wonderful woman who very, very quickly in our time of dealing with her, even on that very first day, it became clear that what had happened to this family was pretty horrific. Something had happened. And the two children, but especially the boy, were just completely in shutdown mode. Just shut down. They couldn't engage the world. They couldn't look anyone in the eye. The only person they felt comfortable with was their mother. And she was bearing this burden of grief from having lost her husband in whatever this horrible event was, and also the responsibility of looking after her children. And over the course of that day, the first day processing on the island takes about 16 hours. So they arrive on the boat, they get initial health checks, they get provided with certain things, access to a toilet. It's one of the first things people always want. They're often seasick. They get driven by a bus up to the top of the island where there's a detention centre, and we process all things like their property. They go and have AFP interviews. They get proper health checks. They get all these things that happen in that first sort of 24 hours, I guess. But 16-hour day that first day. It's a massive day. And even in that time, I spent some time just trying to get to know this family a little bit. I managed a team that ran that centre at the top of the island, so I'd keep going back there, and I got to know this family quite well. And I decided, I'm a former youth worker, I'll declare that. So after school, I went and studied theology for a bit, worked as a youth pastor. I'm like, I'm gonna put some of those skills into action here. I'm gonna see if I can crack this 12-year-old. I'm gonna see if I can get him to open up to me, and just see if I can do it anymore. and because, something's gone on here and I think he probably needs someone to reach out to him like that. So I did. And I went up to him and I'd make jokes and I'd smile and I'd laugh and I'd ask him to high-five me and just shut down, complete shutdown. And he's the first person I've ever come across which I couldn't get it done. I couldn't get him to open up to me. It didn't matter how hard I tried. I spoke with his mother and I got to know his mother. I made sure his mother was in on the act and that she was comfortable with me taking a bit more of an interest in him than I might for some of the other people around the centre, and made sure I was talking with her and finding out a bit about her story. And one day I was having a conversation with her and I feel this kind of tug on the back of my shirt. It was during another boat had arrived actually, so I was up there for this other boat arrival and I felt this tug on my shirt and I was chatting to this boy's mum and I turned around and it was him. And he looked at me like this, he just goes, "You're Spider-Man." He hits me and just runs. Straight off in the other direction. I'm like, youth worker comes out, I run after him, right? So I'm chasing him around Phosphate Hill. And if you've ever been to Phosphate Hill, it's made of old mining camp dongers, right? So it's this tiny little area with a pool fence around it. It's a family facility, an alternative place of detention. Still not a very nice place. We had crammed about 800 people into what should have been about 200 beds. And so it was a bit nuts at the time. And so we're running around here. This is an immigration officer in full immigration uniform, and everybody knows he's the centre director, running around after this 12-year-old, trying to skip through and not bowl people over as we go. And we had a blast, and I caught him, obviously, because that's what you do if you want to win. And, and I caught him, and it was fantastic. And ever since then, he'd call me Spider-Man, sure. And I said, no, dude, I'm Superman, not Spider-Man. He's pathetic. But we had this relationship. I'm a big Superman guy. Had this relationship that suddenly blossomed. And it was really from that moment that I realised there are opportunities for people in immigration detention to actually resolve some issues. If it's done well, maybe not in a detention environment, but if it's done well, people who are really very broken can actually be healed. It's possible. It was possible for this boy to come out of his shell to an immigration officer, let alone to somebody who he might feel more comfortable with. Broken lives can change. And I suppose that was the moment where I realised what goes on in a detention centre matters a lot. It matters a lot. I want to fast forward a little bit to another story. After Christmas Island, I did 12 months on the island. I finished up in January of 2011. 2010, in December, was when the boat crash happened, and that was kind of, for me, the culmination of a whole year of just a lot of hard work. I worked very, very hard, long hours in a really difficult job. Wonderful, wonderful experiences on Christmas Island in some ways, but it was at the end of that year that I was exhausted. I said to the department, look, I did my time, hey, I'm done. I just want to go back to a nice, cushy job in Canberra where I can sleep a normal amount of hours in the night without getting a phone call to say there's a boat sinking 90 miles off the island. I'm done. And they said, well, we want to send you to another detention centre, but don't worry, it's a walk in the park. It's called Sherga. It's up in Far North Queensland. You've never heard of it. I'm like, all right. How much does it pay again? All right, okay, I'll go. And I got up to Sherga, and I was the centre manager of this facility, which was on a RAF base, an RAAF base, temporary facility. It was all right. It wasn't too bad. It wasn't the worst of all the detention centres, to be honest. It wasn't overcrowded. That was one thing I was really glad about. It was a massive, massive area, although there wasn't much to do other than a swimming pool. 400 Afghans. And I have to say, I've got a real soft spot for the Afghans. Not just because their stories are so awesome, but because the Afghan people are, at least the ones I met anyway, there's probably some horrible ones too, but they are some of the most awesome people I ever came across. I loved it. I enjoyed sitting down and listening and chatting. Great sense of humour, great food. They're just a wonderful people. Anyway, I'm totally biased on this, and I should declare that up here. Anyway, 400 Afghans, easiest centre in the world to run ever because everyone got on really well. They were really thankful for the services we provided. The centre was running relatively well at the time in comparison to some of the horrific stories in other places such as Villawood. And I'm like, this is actually the easiest. This is a walk in the park. And that was great right up until early March in 2011, so a few years ago now. When Christmas Island kind of went up in smoke, you might remember it, the AFP came in with some, guns, and the whole place or a section of the place got burnt down. It was horrible. And one of the things the department did was to say, right, we've got a group of people here who are involved in a violent riot in protest. We also have about 1,800 other people on the island who are not involved. How do we get them out the way? How do we actually try and make sure the people who are there who aren't involved and who don't want to be involved in that action can be safe? And so they moved 1,000 people off Christmas Island in 14 days, which is pretty remarkable, right? That's a lot of airplanes. To do it, though, they needed somewhere to take them. Detention centres on the mainland were all expanded, including Sherga. And I got a phone call from the deputy CEO, or the deputy secretary, as it's called, a lady called Jackie Wilson, and she calls me, and I knew Jackie quite well. She's my boss's 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 boss kind of thing. You get the picture? Like second in charge of immigration. Calls me up and says, we're going to take your centre, which has got 400 Afghans, and we're going to send another 800 people there, and they're arriving at the end of the week. And I said, Jackie, no, you're not. Not because I said this, but you told me to be a walk in the park, but we can't cope with that many people here at Sherga. It's a big centre, I get that, but it's just not going to work. I promise you it's not going to work. We argued, I fought. Talk about career limiting, it doesn't matter, I fought it. And I'm like, it actually did pretty good for my career in the end. But the point is that, but I didn't know that at the time is the point. Feel for me for a sec. So they decided instead of 800 people, they would send 400 people, and I'm not joking, that phone call was on a Tuesday afternoon, and the Friday night the first plane arrived. And we had five Hercules before that, which brought in temporary facilities like marquees and tents to go and house a whole bunch of new people in. Introduce new nationalities. It was a massive, massive operation. Big week, right? I was involved in a local church up in Weipa. It's a fantastic church. If you ever go to Weipa, on a fishing trip usually is why people go there, unless they work for Rio Tinto. AOG Church, Western Cape AOG, is a wonderful, tiny, tiny little group of believers who meet their faith. It's got people from Fiji, it's got local Indigenous leaders, it's got Rio Tinto workers, it's got immigration workers, or it did up until they shut the centre. Wonderful, wonderful little church. And I was going along there, and I had a small group, a couple of teachers, a couple of people from the hospital. And we were at my small group, at my house. I had a really nice house up there that they paid for, having Bible study when I get this phone call on Thursday night, the day before the arrival is going to happen. We've got people at work still because we had a whole thing going on that week. I had a phone call saying one of the case managers, Serco security officers was walking around the centre with an IHMS nurse, a nurse who we employ to go and provide medical and clinical services. When some of the asylum seekers had go into that room over there, the door's locked. And they'd kind of encouraged them to go in, and they did. They went over and knocked on the door. Sure enough, the door wasn't open, and they tried a few times. Got a security guard to come down so they could use a master key to unlock the room. It's very unusual for this to happen. So usually the centre manager gets a call that says this is going on. At the time, I delegated those basically operational calls to my deputy. So I didn't get a call about it. I was still at Bible study. I was taking a night out trying to get my head into gear again. They broke into the room, as they needed to do, and there was a guy who'd taken his own life in there. And I then got the call straight away, and for the rest of the night, it was my job to look after and manage that situation. Over the course of the next little while, we found out that this young man, a guy called Mekdad, had been pressured by his family back home to send money, basically. Why haven't you sent money, and why haven't you brought us out? Like, why aren't we in Australia too? Where are you, and why aren't you sending that? He's trying to explain that he's in Western Cape, in Cape York, and it's like, where's that? They don't understand Australian. I mean, even if they did, even if he got it, it's like, how do you explain that you're in Sherga to someone, to your family? Like, where's Sherga? No one, even I don't know now, and I went there for 6 months. Like, he was in this situation where he was feeling an incredible amount of responsibility for his mother and brothers and father, who's an older gentleman, and he couldn't bear it anymore. And so even though Sherga was this wonderful, beautiful place, the very experience of detention, as good as it can get, I kid you not, Sherga is as good as a detention centre can get for a single adult male, it was still too much for this guy. And fair enough, right? The reality is he was a guy who had been sent as the oldest son to go and seek protection for the family who were in themselves displaced people. They were in Pakistan. They had been for a few years. They'd sent him because they couldn't stay in Pakistan. They couldn't stay there. They couldn't survive. So they'd sent their son to go and bring them out to Australia. And he'd failed them, according to them. And so they were picking on him for it and saying, why haven't you done it? And the reason is because they'd paid a people smuggler out of borrowed money. And the people smuggler was now threatening the family. And they were going to kill him, basically, or kill some of them. And that's what people smugglers often did. I had many, many stories of people who were under unbelievable amounts of stress in detention because they had usually they'd sold whatever their business or whatever they had, as much money as they could gather together, and paid the people smuggler, but it still wasn't enough. And the people smuggler was like, no worries, you go, I'll sort it all out. And when you get to Australia, you've got 6 months. No worries, 6 months, you'll find a job and you can begin paying me back. We'll sort it out down there. Don't worry about it. So they do. Of course you do if you've got no other option. You take it. And of course, what happens is you get to Australia and they detain you for an indefinite period of time, often longer than 6 months, and how the heck are you supposed to begin paying it back? And so they start threatening your family, which is why there's a lot of stressed people in detention. It's funny that when they've got these sorts of stories and they've got pressure coming from other countries where they're going, my family are being hurt or they're at risk of dying, I'm responsible for organising family reunion, bringing them out to join. It's like, of course they're stressed out. It's just another story in a line of horrific stories that they've had to live through. And this guy found that too much and took his life. At the end, the coronial inquest for Mekdad didn't find any of the department's officers at fault. But at the end of the day, it wasn't probably the department's officers. It probably wasn't Serco's fault. It probably wasn't immigration's fault. It was probably just the fault of the policy of mandatory detention, which is completely ridiculous as a policy. 4.8 million people come to Australia every year. Do you know that? 4.8 million people. Tourist visas, business visas, student visas. They show up at the airports, most of them, the vast majority of them, and they leave. Some of them overstay, lots of them overstay. And we know they're here and we're fine with it. And most of them arrive on little visas they get online. A few of them have to actually put a paper application in for various sorts of reasons. And at the end of the day, it's a very, very junior officer sitting in a Sydney office or a Melbourne office processing centre who looks at it for a very short amount of time and goes, yeah, that seems fine. Don't get me wrong, those officers have a hard job. They've got to go through thousands of those applications every week. It's not an easy job, right? But they're not exactly applying a great deal of scrutiny to the potential risk this person has to the Australian community. In other words, 4.8 million people are arriving. Some of them have more scrutiny than others, so not all of them just walk on in, but a lot of them do. If someone's going to blow up Sydney Harbour Bridge, they're going to be here as an Australian citizen, or they're going to come in on a different visa. They're not going to come by boat. It's way too dangerous. Why would you do that if you've got a strategy like that? You've got money behind you, probably. It's a dumb idea to think that we need to lock people up long enough to find out about their security risk. It's completely ridiculous in every public policy sense. The whole culmination of my story was on Nauru, and I want to just quickly share with you how I came to leave. They've turned off the time thing, so I'm just going to keep talking as if I've got the rest of the night. Sorry. I don't. There was about 6 minutes when they turned it off, so I'm probably right now on the end. But look, I was on Nauru. They sent me up to Nauru I was responsible for all offshore processing. I worked in Canberra as the director of offshore operations when I went back to Canberra after Sherga. And they sent me out to a couple of other detention centres and ultimately to Nauru. And there was a week there that I'll never forget. In this week, 3 things happened. One of them was that there was a regular demonstration taking place. Where asylum seekers on Nauru were asking, when are we going to have a chance to put our story? When are we going to be able to tell our story to an interviewer and say, I'm a refugee? I just want to start the interviews. I want the whole thing processed, but can we at least just get going on it? They were asking for the date that this processing would start. I had the date. It was the 18th of March, 2013. Wasn't allowed to share it because you're not allowed to tell people who are involved in any kind of protest action anything. You have to withdraw. In fact, Julia Gillard got on television and said, we don't negotiate with people who are involved in protest action. So I had the date, and I was instructed not to tell them, even though it was the one thing that they needed. That was the first thing. Second thing was, as part of that action, there were a group of people who'd sewn their lips and a whole bunch of really horrific things going on as part of that protest action, horrific in lots and lots of ways. And there was one guy who was not a very well man, and he actually tried to take his own life by jumping off one of the buildings that we had there, a 2-story building. A security guard, one of his friends, a really wonderful security guard who'd made built a really good relationship with this guy, really to look out for him, went up and tackled him. Actually just full-on bear hug tackle to the ground to stop him jumping. Saved his life. One of the people who was the ringleader organising a lot of this kind of horrific protesting stuff accused the security guard of assault, and he was stood down from his duties. And I'm like, oh, wow, have we got a system gone wrong? When you've got an asylum seeker who says it's better that the guy jumps because it's better for my political purposes. There are some bad eggs, is the point. Not all of them, very, very few, but this guy was a bit of a challenge. I was saying it's better that he jumps because that'll make a much better political point for me and the agenda that I've got to try and get out of Nauru than it is for the security guard to have his job. And it's like, wait, this security guard was doing exactly what we want the security guards to do. Exactly what we want. Tackle him. Who cares about whether he gets done for assault? It's better that he saves his life. And he did. Way better outcome. And I'm so impressed by that security guard who took the fall, literally, for this guy. Third thing that happened was that there was a guy who was suffering serious psychosis. A psychiatrist was on the island at the time. We don't always have psychiatrists there. But he had an assessment by the psychiatrist that he was psychotic and needed immediate care that wasn't available on Nauru. So he instructed the department, as he's required to do, to organise a medical evacuation. Usually, when that happens, what happens is a public servant like myself gets this advice. It's medical professional advice that I certainly don't know enough about it. I'm totally going to listen to that advice. And so I say to the department back in Canberra, organise the medevac. And they go to the people who organise it and send the plane, right? And we just have to find out when the plane arrives. It should be pretty straightforward. Someone needs the help. We've got medical advice that it's absolutely required. You organise it. Simple. You sort out the money later, and it's only $180,000 at most. And I know that's a lot of money, but really, for one guy, let's be honest, we spend a lot more on other people. So, you organise the medevac. Problem, of course, is that this time the decision wasn't just made, it was taken to the minister's office. And so the decision sat as a political decision inside, at the time it was Minister Bowen's office. Minister Bowen took 48 hours. And I don't know if it was that he couldn't decide whether or not to do it or not for political purposes, or if it was because he had no sway in the cabinet anymore because he'd backed the wrong horse when Kevin Rudd challenged for the leadership the first time. But whatever happened, it took 48 hours. give you a bit of context, earlier we'd had a guy who had gone on voluntary starvation for 53 days with the view of proving to the Australian government that he could get himself back to the mainland by medevac. And it had worked. He'd been taken down to Brisbane, started eating within 12 hours of arriving in the mainland, and he was sent back to Nauru shortly thereafter. But the Australian government was so keen not to let asylum seekers hold them over the barrel that they didn't want to medevac this guy. So it took more than 2 days for him to get on the plane. In the meantime, he's just lying sedated in a hospital bed. And I'm like, wow, the political scenario where a decision about a psychiatrist's call is overrun by political outcomes is nuts. It's completely mad. And I should never have to deal with that as a public servant. So those three things all happened in the same week. And it was at that point that I went, wait, hang on, I'm a Christian. That story of the Good Samaritan, Jesus wasn't telling it as a laugh. He wasn't telling it because it was interesting. He wasn't telling it because it was some humanist perspective that says, oh, look, everybody should go and be nice to everybody. This is real stuff. And I was a Christian. I was claiming I was going to church. I'm like, wait a sec. Former youth pastor, studied theology, public servant trying to save the world. Got that wrong. Oh, well. Anyway, now you're in a position where your job is requiring you to do things which are directly at odds with the gospel, directly at odds with what God calls us to. And just like those people who still go to Shire churches, I'm going to pick on someone, just like the average upper middle class white person in Australia who hasn't really had to confront this issue and probably isn't shocked by the things they see advocates do on telly, at some point as a Christian you have to come to a realisation that the gospel does mean more than just nice stories. And we can't be satisfied if this stuff goes on our watch. We have an obligation. It's not a we're inviting you to get involved. It's a you actually, if you claim to follow Jesus, then you have to do what he says. And one of the things he calls you to is to go and deal with this issue. These are the people arriving on our doorstep and asking for our help. Whatever your policy ends up being, it's got to start there. Thanks for listening to me. I'm looking forward to hearing Jarrod later on.